Hello and welcome to another episode of Movies That Make Us. I'm Jake.
I'm Tracy.
I'm Loki.
And I'm Val.
And we do have a very special guest with us today. Loki, welcome so very much to the show. We are so glad to have you here to talk about this movie that you've done called The Uncomfortable Truth. We couldn't be happier. I mean, it's just a thrill to have you here and talk about this. It's such a great film, such a powerful film, and so much what we need right now. And so thank you for being here on the show.
Well, thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, Loki, a couple weeks ago, we kind of put together our own list of movies to support Black Lives Matter. And then like Netflix and Amazon both came up with, a list of movies to watch. And your movie, The Uncomfortable Truth, is on the Black Lives Matter channel on Amazon Prime. How cool is that?
That's very cool. I had no idea.
Yeah, and it deserves to be there. And this is kind of a follow-up to a film that you did a few years ago about your mother. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's kind of a lot of times I call it the prequel. A lot of people, it's a film of my mom called An Ordinary Hero. My mom's civil rights. But, this is her. I'll show you the shirt here. See, my mom's the next column. Her mugshot from the Freedom Rides before they put her on death row. Watch the movie to learn the rest. But a lot of people were what's her background? What's her story? And so that's why I kind of call this the prequel to that, because it takes you all the way back to our family history, all the way back to 1610 when they arrived in Jamestown, and it rolls you forward. And so it's just the history of institutional racism in America. So our family helped create the problem. We helped create slavery and so forth. But then my mom comes along and changes the paradigm in our family history by becoming an activist and helping end Jim Crow and segregation and turning away from that history. And so that's where we go from there. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. I know toward the end of the film, you're talking about your grandmother, who sounds like she was an incredible lady in her own right, very generous as far as the money that she had, put a lot of her grandkids through college and things like that. But she still had those racist tendencies that she had grown up with and ideas that she had grown up with. And I think it kind of puts into focus what a lot of people are struggling with right now as we discover our own racist ideas and thoughts. And how do you come to terms with that, or your own family history? How do you come to terms with that and move forward and become more part of the solution instead of always kind of clinging to that past and what it always has been?
Yeah. Was that a question?
No, well, it wasn't. As I went through, I realized I found that part very powerful. And I guess what would you say to people as a lot of people now are coming to grips with that and having to confront that a little bit? And how do you do that and move forward?
Well, one thing is when we talk about this in the film, yes, you are kind of a summary of your past in that respects, but you get to define who you are and where you move forward. My mother made that choice, and we all can make that today. And one of the things I think we're seeing a lot, so we've had, I think it was the past 20 days, over 350,000 views on Amazon.
Wow.
Of The Uncomfortable Truth. And I'm getting tons of messages from people going, I had no idea, particularly from a historical standpoint. Mm-hmm. And they're relating as well, going, now I understand what's going on in regards of why we're having this movement today, what the hurt and everything that's been taking place. It's all in context now. Mm-hmm. My family, we were one of the original slaveholding families, right? My grandmother was a segregationist to the day she died. So this whole narrative, I didn't do any of that, but I benefited from it. And there's this sort of element, I think, where people feel like they've been lied to, because they have been, from a historical standpoint. But now we're at this junction where we can go, wow, okay, now that I know, what do I do with it? I say that to a lot of people. I'm like, look, this isn't your fault, okay? You didn't do anything in the past. You're doing what you're doing now. What are you doing today that contributes or takes away from, right? How are you going to move forward? Now that you know, what are you going to do with it? And that's where we're sitting right now. Particularly the white people is going, okay, now what? What do I do? And that's,
Loki, at what point in your life when did it hit you, and at what age did it hit you that you were like, I have to tell this story? I have to write this book. I have to make this documentary. Like, you just felt like it was important to you.
Well, it's kind of weird because I never wanted to be my mother's shadow, right? And now my whole life is about my mom and the work she done, and I'm trying to carve up my own space in that and have my own voice. I voted anything that had to do with my mom for years. I honored her and so forth, of course, but respected my mother. But I didn't want to be that person, just coattails, whatever else, and because you want to be your own person, have your own identity. But everything always kept coming back around to that, coming back around to my mom. And it's when I did An Ordinary Hero that people would say to me, I'd ask about, can I use this photo, or would you do an interview? And they'd say, for Joan, anything. I was like, wow, this is my mom. And I have a responsibility to this. Now, I don't have to sit at the lunch counters like my mom did because, well, she did. But I have to do what I can do because doing nothing is not an option. And so I took the gifts that I have, and the skills that I've been given and so forth and acquired, and I use those with my voice. And that's with the films and the book and the foundation that I created that exists to end racism through education. So, we provide curriculums to schools and such to help, educate a new generation so that we don't repeat the past.
There was a couple of points in the film. I mean, there was a lot of information in the film that I wasn't aware of, and it's very educational, but there were a few points that really hit home to me, and they kind of bookended the movie. At the beginning of the film, you open up right out of the gate and you say, my family owned 100 slaves. And to stand in front of a room and to say that to a mixed crowd, like I have, goosebumps right now, because it is the uncomfortable truth to say something like that. And then to find out that indeed is not the truth.
Right.
It's this truth that, stories have just like become myth, and myth becomes stories. And you kind of explain that in the movie.
Right.
And so you don't really know what to believe until you start asking questions. But back then, people just chose sides. A lot of people didn't ask questions. They just took whatever they heard, and they're like, this is my truth, and this is how I'm going to live my life. And lives were hurt because of this. And then to jump forward, you were on social media, which is where a lot of us get our news these days, whether it's correct or not. And you saw a couple friends of yours unknowingly being racist, and you just thought to yourself, and this is something we see every day, somebody just saying it's a joke. Don't take it so serious, lighten up, it's just a joke. But to a lot of people, these things are not jokes. And then to another half of people, this is their reality that they've chosen to be their truth, is to believe these things. So it's so crazy to me to have stories from two very different generations. And yet we have people believing the same things because they're just stories being spun, and you just decide not to question them.
Yeah.
Well, so how do you go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, so, I mean, it seems so far apart, these two generations, us now, and then, back when your grandmother was younger, but we're not that different.
We're not. It's just the technology is. The myth making still exists. And so my family, the myth making, was, my grandmother was very, very poor. I mean, she used to tell us stories of, she had a Christmas when all they got was an orange, right? But so the myth making was this 100 slave narrative. Look how wealthy we are, this sort of stuff. And America is the same way. We have this myth making that we do about our history. because no one likes to think of themselves as an SOB, right?
Right.
And so that carries through. You know, we have a tendency to do that in our personal lives. Facebook's a great example of that, and Instagram and so forth. No one ever tells the boring stuff. They always just tell the great stuff, right?
Right.
But but what we miss is the opportunity to learn and to grow. So, you know, American history is told very much this, you know, we went from great to greater to great to greater, you know, and we just keep on going, right? We started awesome and we just kept getting awesomer, right? And that's obviously not the case, but a lot of that's missing. And our families do the same thing. So by deconstructing the mythology of my family, where myth becomes legend, right? And legend becomes fact and whatever.
Right.
That in American history, Juneteenth is a great example. We just had this.
Mm-hmm.
So, we kind of gloss over the whole idea of, you know, that America made slavery, right? Chattel slavery. And you'll get people who go, oh, yeah, well, you know, we had slavery in Africa. Like, okay, if you want to talk about that, we can. I know you don't know anything about it, but we live in America, so let's talk about America. And we kind of gloss over the whole what actually happened to create that, and the debates that took place. You know, when they're writing the Declaration of Independence and signing it and so forth, there's these debates that are going. Should we really have slavery when we're talking about independence and freedom? And yet they kept compromising. They kept falling back on their old tropes. But yet, you know, Juneteenth is a celebration of 4 million people freed from the worst kind of slavery. Right, American chattel slavery. Now, America created it, but we also ended it. You know, and yes, so there's progress, but then we fell back into Jim Crow, right? You know, you take 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But then America rose up to its challenge, and you know, the citizens, and you ended segregation, and you know, and you had the Voting Rights Act, right? Now we're seeing this resurgence again. And so there's this progression that we can learn from our mistakes. And we're trying to form a more perfect union. We're not there yet. And so that's much more interesting and a better way for people to learn than just, you know, everything's perfect. Right.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So from a family standpoint, telling that story and you know, again, it's like you said, you're telling it to this mixed audience. I mean, oh my gosh, you know, you're airing the laundry, if you will, and it's like, well, yeah. I mean, until you're willing to confront the truth, you know, you're just living in a lie, and that's not a healthy way to live. Once the truth will set you free, we've heard that before, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
There's a great liberation that comes with that gives us this opportunity to really then grow, and grow not just as individuals, but our relationships with people. We live in a very hyper-segregated society, and it's conditioned. We're conditioned that way. People, well, there's not a lot of black people in Utah. There's plenty of black people in Utah, you know, and Asian Americans, and, you know, and Hispanics and so forth. And there's Utah is actually kind of diverse, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you go looking for it, but you got to make that effort. But if you're living in your biases all the time, you're never going to do that anyways.
And I really like
powerful part. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to touch on the education part, Loki, because I mean, like, I never knew about the situation that happened in Tulsa. Right. With Black Wall Street until I saw in Watchmen back in March of this year. Yeah. I know about the bombings that happened in Philadelphia. I didn't know about a lot of these things. And my family, my mom had a very romanticized version of the South. She was very interested in the Civil War, and she had a very romanticized vision of it. And it was interesting in your film when you talk about Stone Mountain, because they took us there once. Yeah. And I was just like, at the time I was going, okay, this is cool. I mean, my mom was telling me, you know, this is all about states' rights. And I didn't know a lot of the history that had occurred and happened until I was in college and even beyond. Like I said, I didn't know about Tulsa until a couple months ago. Yeah. So I think it's incredibly important that we continue to educate ourselves. And I thank you for putting information into the schools.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's there's a thing where people of color in particular get really frustrated. You know, how do you not know this?
Mm-hmm.
There's an assumption that white people should know this automatically anyways, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just the same way white people assume that every black person knows black history, right? And when I challenge that with white people, I'm going, well, what are you? And they're like, well, I'm Irish. I'm like, okay, well, start telling me Irish history. They're like,
yeah,
like, okay, like, okay, I get it. But you know what I'm saying? So I'm still seeing some of the stuff that I saw 40 years ago in the textbooks today. Right?
Mm-hmm.
When I was in elementary school. That tells you how old I am now. All right, 48. So
I'm right behind you.
yeah. So now, if you take that, you know, let's just go 1980, right? So the teachers that were teaching me then would have been, you know, growing up in the 50s.
Right.
Their teachers would have been born in 1910, right? And so the people who taught them, if you keep going, not, you know, so we just keep teaching each other the same thing over and over again, that mythology. And so you get people who sit on these school boards and so forth and make these decisions, and what do they go to? The same things they're so used to talking about. And it's very uncomfortable to them, because now you grew up on all of this, and it's right, but it's not the whole story. And,
right.
And now all of a sudden, you know, you're challenging someone's sense of being, right? And that's what's going on with these statues, for example. Like when we talk about, you know, the lost cause and the scorification of the South, you know, state rights, the right to do what? Let's have this conversation. But
yeah,
so now you have these
more
statues,
specific, right?
Right. So now we're reorienting the conversation about the statue. So now it's like, hey, look, remember the South seceded; they were traitors. You know, we don't create statues to traitors. I said to someone recently, I said, look, if an American soldier went during World War II, went off and fought for the Nazis and killed Americans and then came back, would we build statues for him? If someone went and fought for Al Qaeda and came back, would we build statues? Well, no, of course not. So why would we do it for Confederate soldiers? And they don't know the history of that. Let alone, what does that do to our brothers and sisters, our Black brothers and sisters, who have to see that? Because memorials are meant to say, this is the ideal. This is what we want people to be like. This is the values that we honor. Well, we're starting to understand now that, look, those statues do not represent the values that we want America to be, and our ideals, which is, we don't believe in enslaving people. We fought a war for it. Why would we continue to memorialize people for that? This needs to end.
Yeah. I think that's a great point. And listening to you talk about history, it reminded me, I studied history at the University of Utah. One of the classes I took was African American history, which is such a weird idea that there has to be a separate course that teaches all of these things. And that's where I learned about a lot of the things like the Tulsa Massacre and like Juneteenth and things like that I hadn't learned up to that point. And I'm grateful for that experience. And as you talk about taking down these memorials and discovering history and learning about history, what are some good resources and places for people to go? Because it seems like anywhere you go online is going to be skewed one way or another. And so where are some good unbiased resources for people to go, other than, of course, your film, for them to get some of this information?
Right. Well, nothing's unbiased. I mean, everything's filtered through something. I mean, we just have to accept that. And you can find anything to validate whatever your position is. That's the beauty of the internet now. But for some, you know, real actual scholarly stuff, you know, there's, take a look at the New York Times bestselling list right now. And that's a great place to start. And that, a lot of that is about deconstructing this white narrative and so forth. From a historical standpoint, there's actually I got a book right here. It's an old book. It only goes to 1964, but it's before the Mayflower. And it's a great history book. You know, for example, there's Carol Anderson, who wrote the book White Rage. That's great. That's on the best-selling list right now. That's a great book. There's I'm trying to think of like all the different books out there. The Brain Goes to Freeze.
There was a lot that you listed in the movie, and you went kind of through your collection in the movie.
Freeze the frame, zoom in, and look at my bookshelf, and there's even more.
Perfect. Perfect.
But the films and stuff. I mean, obviously, I can tap my own. By all means, the newest one after Selma about voter suppression. But there's plenty of things. You have to take everything for what it is, but add to it, and then start to just kind of fill your brain, because we default to these biases because that's what our brain is filled with, right? This long history of information that just tells us, how to think. And so that's when I say in the film, The Uncomfortable Truth, look, even my mom still has racist tendencies. Gosh, how's that possible? I mean, she's Joan. And it's like, well, because she grew up in America. But she's worked really hard to reprogram her brain. And that when something comes up, she then analyzes, okay, why did I think that? What triggered that? And starts to do a deep dive on herself. Instead of just like, oh, well, that was unfortunate, or not even care, not even think about it, or create an excuse. We get a lot of excuses for ourselves. Or when we say something, people make excuses. Well, let me give you a quick example. So I have a film called Black, White, and Us, which is about racism through the lens of transracial adoptions in Utah. Just a mouthful. But it's about white families who live in Utah who thought racism was over and then adopted these black children. And then suddenly realized, oh, it's still alive and kicking. And in the film, this character says, he's having an epiphany. He's working on this book called Courageous Conversations. And his co-author, who's black and from Baltimore, this one guy is white from Utah. And he's like, what do I do, Glenn? What do I do to end racism? And his answer is very simple. He says, believe me. Just believe me. So when our friends tell us that something happened, we don't try to qualify it.
Right.
Qualifying is actually for us, because we feel safe in the myth. Right. I say that comes from the truth. We like the myth. It makes us feel good. Right. And anything that counters that, all of a sudden we get uncomfortable. And so, well, clearly the cop must have pulled you over for something.
Right.
Right. And well, maybe you misinterpreted that. And that's the purpose of all of this, is to have that understanding, so that we can go, okay. They always the question Lou Von Braun says to me all the time is, now what? Great, all this. Now what are you going to do with it? Right.
I want to talk about LaVon Brown for a minute and kind of jump back to the film, because he is such an intricate part to the storytelling. Because what I like so much about this documentary is that you get all sorts of perspectives, because there isn't just one side to what racism looks like or feels like. And to have LaVon there and to see him and your mom, together for a minute she's so tiny. And to imagine her and him sitting at these counters, and thinking she's getting pulled out. They're both being, two totally different people being pulled out of, these restaurants or, off the buses or, during this, but they both just felt like they needed to be there. And when he talks about, this is when you say quantifying, he talks about when people say, well, what about black on black violence? Right. And he's like, well, what about white on white violence? Like, let's focus on what we need to talk about right now. And that it's that we have a racism problem and we have police violence. Right. And everybody's like, but what about this? But what about this? But what about this? Well, yes, we can talk about all those things too, but let's focus for a minute and try and fix this problem. And, his stories about, neighborhoods and, how people want to have those conversations, you just kind of opened your eyes about what we don't see from our side.
Right.
And I have to say, even though this is a very heavy educational documentary, there's some humor in here. I laughed a few times when your mom's like, and we have the kids to prove it, but she's like, well, you've got your kids and I've got my kids. And, there's a couple times you like to slide in a little joke here and there. And, I caught it, but, it's okay to have humor. But it also, all of these things we need to talk about. But, tell me how he has been such an influence on your life. You said you've known him now for a long time. I'm sure you guys have had a lot of conversations.
Well, and we still do every week. Actually, we have a podcast called The Uncomfortable Truth, where we continue that conversation that we started in the film, and we continue to expand on that and talk about things topical today and other things that we never even touched on in the film. Right? We have guests that we bring in. So, like just recently, we had Dr. William A. Smith, who did the study and coined the phrase racial battle fatigue, right? And so what is that? And these are conversations that Levon and I have because we have a level of trust with each other that we can do this, that a lot of white people probably just, a lot of white people just don't have. And so it's hard for them to even have that level to ask those sort of questions. And so that's what Levon and I are doing, is asking those questions. I'll play the devil's advocate and really go white on him, those sort of things, and just ask those sort of questions that white people think about, right? But what's interesting about Levon and the film in particular, this was actually a friend of mine a white guy who went to an HBCU, an historical black college, right? He was in the Army and everything. And he's watching the film. He saw an early cut of it. He stops about halfway watching it. He calls me up. He says, I don't know, man. I don't know. I don't know about this Levon guy. I think he might be a little too out there for some people. I said, keep watching. By the end of the film, he was like, oh, I get it, man. I just love this guy. Because he starts off the film saying, no, I never liked white people.
Right.
And white people go, what did I do?
What?
Right.
Yeah.
How don't you like me? Right. They take it very personal. At the end of the film,
I didn't question that. I was like, well, we started the film with one guy saying that they owned 100 slaves and then a black guy saying, I have no reason to like white people. I just kind of took the context clues and I was okay with it.
Yeah. But you understand the America he grew up in.
Right.
But then you understand, his experiences. And so I will throw out my world as well as the stats. And then Levon gives it the perspective from his position. Right. My mom was the first white woman he ever trusted, because trusting a white woman in Mississippi would get you killed.
Right.
And he knew that from an early age because he was 11 years old when Emmett Till was killed in 1955. So all the evidence told him, you got to be careful around white people. And that's the history he has. Nothing I did, but that caution was built into that from his experiences. So then along comes my mom, and that story she doesn't want him to tell at the very beginning. At that museum, and he's like, yeah, we weren't going to tell that story. Well, we actually do tell the story on the podcast, and it's a very telling episode for those who actually want to do something. Who now they know, and they're like, okay, I got this information. I've watched the film. Now what do I do? How do I get involved? That particular episode's called "The Wrong Time to Be Right." Okay, and it's not just my mom, and it's not just because she's white. That we find out in that podcast the dynamics of what's going on, how we all need to operate. But Levon is he's just this incredible individual. After the film, a couple years later, he actually had a stroke. He's doing better now. He's probably about 80% back. And sometimes sometimes he's a little more than other times on the podcast and stuff. But he's still very much with it and has his mobility and stuff. But he's just, him and I just had that rapport and we understood each other.
And he does.
When he said that your mom was very, everyone liked her because she was who she was. She was exactly, the person that she seemed. There was no pretense. She was passionate. She wanted to help. And she had a lot to lose by doing this. And he said he didn't really understand. Like, she's this white girl that has everything coming to her in a good way. And she just said, I don't care about any of this lifestyle that's being handed to me. I feel like I've got to go over here. And people just trusted her.
Not everyone. No. Levon didn't trust her in the beginning. What is she up to? Even when she was at Tougaloo College, which is, historical black college, she was the first white student there. It was like, okay, she's had it easy. What is she up to? There's always that level of suspicion. Is she a spy, or anything else? And it's building that level of trust, because there's that massive level of distrust that exists, in the African American community, for very good reason. When you watch the film, it becomes very evident and understandable. And it's not you personally, right? It's just the way society has been structured by us to create that level of distrust. So that needs to be earned. And my mom had to do the same thing. Now she was already involved in the movement and stuff, so people knew that there was those elements. But again, that's great on the surface, but individually, Levon, for example, I mean, he was just like, I don't know about it. What is she up to? And so there's that level of proof that had to take place. Of course, a lot of white people didn't like my mom, for what she was doing. She's a traitor and all those sort of things. But even her own parents, her mother in particular, was aghast at what she was doing. So,
yeah. Jake, you were going to ask a question?
Yeah.
Oh, Tracy's got one. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Jake.
No, go ahead, Tracy.
Rock, paper,
Loki,
scissors.
I just wanted wanted you to elaborate for those in our audience who haven't seen your film yet.
Mm-hmm.
I think when we're taught about slavery, there's still kind of this glossiness that we put on it. And we talk about picking cotton and being out in the fields. We don't talk about, and even after slavery ended, I want to talk for you a second, if we could, about Jesse Washington.
Yeah.
And the story and his experience, because
17-year-old.
It blew me away. Yeah. Could you please, for our audience, kind of go into that for a minute?
Yeah. So Jesse Washington. So this is taking place. There's massive amounts of lynchings taking place, and this is going up in from the 1880s and up until the 1960s. There was one person was lynched every other day in America for 88 years. Jesse Washington was one particular example. Now, there was actually two, but I never told the second one in the film. I took it out. But Jesse Washington in particular was this 17-year-old who was accused of, raping a white woman or something to that effect. It's always that. It's always something sexual, right? It always has to be the case. That's the easy thing, just like in Emmett Till. And so they had a very speedy trial, and outside was this mob of thousands of people in Waco, Texas, out for a public lynching. They actually, during school break, during recess, the kids were able to come and watch as they burned him alive. And then they took his body and they would break off charred pieces of his body as souvenirs. And they would have postcards that they would take pictures of. And the Postal Service allowed this, for years of sending postcards of lynchings until they finally decided maybe this isn't the best use of the Postal Service, right? But that's just one example. And I had someone, say to me, we did a screening once, and they're like, I can't believe you would show that. I'm like, I didn't even share with you the worst one that I read about, and that was, and I'm blanking on her name, and I feel bad that I do at the moment. But her name was also Mary, and it was in Georgia, and she was stripped naked, hung upside down, and she was pregnant at the time. They doused her with kerosene or something, and then they lit her on fire. They cut her baby out, and the baby was actually alive, and it fell out onto the ground and was crying. And then someone came forward and crushed the baby to keep it from to kill it. Her crime was protesting against the lynching of her husband just a week before.
Oh my God.
That's part of the American story, right? Now, there are people who stood up against that. That's the other part of the story. We have to remember both sides. But there's this ugliness, there's this history. And so when we come to a George Floyd, we come to a Ahmaud Arbery, none of this is happening in a vacuum. And this is why you have Black Lives Matter. This is this history that's this culmination right here. Just because I said your white ignorance is not the same as someone else's Black experience. Just because you didn't know doesn't mean it didn't happen, right? These are real stories, real lives, and so when we say Black lives don't matter as much as white lives, then it becomes well I don't believe that. Well, that's because you just don't know anything, and this is why what's going on, and we're now in the case of a lot of these lynchings and stuff, the police were involved because they were part of the Klan anyways. You had high government officials. There was in the Ordinary Hero. We talk about this in Uncomfortable Truth as well. There's a famous lynching that took place in Georgia of a Jewish man, and no one could figure out who was involved, even though there was a photograph. But no one would identify who these people were, even though it was a mayor and like a former governor and so forth. That somehow no one could identify anybody until everyone was dead.
Wow.
And so it would continue because no one was white people weren't holding white people accountable. Black people couldn't say anything about it, even though people were, right? And they paid for it with their lives. But this is America. There's great things about what we've done, and there's horrible things about what we've done. There's plenty of countries have had issues as well, right? But we live in America, so let's dress America. Let's live up to the ideals that we really should. And each of us need to do that. So I try to do that through the films.
So I think it's interesting as we go through, and as you, it feels like the film is broken down into kind of 3 time periods, right? You have the slavery and the racism that existed there, and then Jim Crow. And we have a tendency to think that this is all in the past, that this all happened.
Right.
And especially, as my kids grow up, when you talk about the Civil Rights Act in 1965, that is going to be ancient history for them. My oldest is 13. That's like way in the past, right? Yeah. But then you talked about the colorblind society. What and as you did, that resonated a lot with me as I thought about a lot of the responses to Black Lives Matter when you hear, well, all lives matter. And I thought this is what we are in the middle of right now. So maybe for our audience, explain a little bit what the colorblind society is and what we're going through right now.
So what you're referring to in particular is these structures that are built upon a foundation of racism. And so while slavery ends, the foundation is still there. And so then a new structure is built on top, which was Jim Crow, segregation. That gets dismantled. And then we built something else on called the colorblind society, which is this new, unique way of talking about things where I don't see color. And there's all this sort of coded language that strips out, we can't openly say racist stuff anymore, right? So we're going to say it in another way, still be racist, and there's still the wink and the nods and so forth. But we're all downstream of the past. So to assume that just because slavery ended or Jim Crow ended doesn't mean racism ended, right? And so with the colorblind society, it's another level of re-enslavement, if you will, with the war on drugs, right? Mass incarceration, school to prison pipeline, all these things where we don't have to call it, it's just a new thing restructured all over again. So when people say, well, I don't see color, I'm colorblind, that's just their way of saying, I don't want to talk about it.
Right.
That's really what it is. And they see themselves as this benevolent individual who has no bias or whatever else. I just see people for people. And that's why they always go back to the same, well, look, I don't judge people by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, just like Dr. King wanted. So you throw out the Dr. King card, I'm safe. No, I'm not racist. I'm not a bigot. I'm not prejudiced. Everyone's prejudiced. Everyone has bias. It doesn't matter what color you are, what gender you are, what orientation you have. Everyone has that. Racism in and of itself is a structure. And that's coupled with power. So you have the individual races, then you have the institution of racism in America.
Right.
Right.
Well,
yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was just going to say, you talk about in the film about how ingrained it is in our society when it comes down to like home loans and the redlining that was happening in building these communities. And now you have for-profit prisons. So there's even more reason to put people into the prison system.
Yeah.
So it's so built into our society, and we just don't know it.
Right. And so white people, we have a tendency, D'Angelo talks about this in her book, White Fragility, wherein most white people see racism as black and white photographs, right? Mm-hmm. You know, literally the ones behind me, right, over there. There we go. There's a black and white. My mom's here for lunch now, right? So those are bad people who did bad things, and that's what racists do. You know, they put on hoods and they burn crosses and these sort of things, and I don't do that. So I'm not a racist,
right?
Because no one wants to think of themselves as an SOB, right? So they ignore the institution side. So white people see racism as that, whereas African Americans, they see it from a broader perspective of the institution of racism that feeds those individuals. And so just because the outward manifestations of racism in regards of those black and white photographs, the lunch counters and the buses and so forth, and the water fountains are gone, doesn't mean racism ended, right? And so that's where this greater understanding of white fragility. Sorry. Someone to come in. Sorry.
No, you're great.
It happens to us all the time.
Yeah, exactly.
It's part of the new normal where you've got people just coming in and out for these things all the time.
Jake's kids show up every once in a while too.
Yeah, totally.
My dogs are in and out of here all the time.
But now we're kind of getting down to kind of the nitty gritty here a little bit. We're starting to talk about this white fragility and the biases and these unconscious biases and so forth, and how we're starting to understand as white people more of how we play into all of this. And so again, like I said, everyone has bias. It doesn't matter if you're black or white. Everyone has bias. We're all prejudiced on some level or another, where we prejudge people when we see them, right? If you're a woman and you've got blonde hair, if you're overweight or this, or you're black or whatever, we're all going to put layers of information that we've been fed, that diet in American culture, right? Where when the second we see someone, we've already formulated what we think, how we think about them. Are they a threat or are they not? Are they smart or are they not? Whatever it might be. Mm-hmm. And so that's the prejudice. Racism is when you couple that with power. And I can I can exercise my bias to the extreme. So that's where you get, the Karens, right? You hear about people with their cell phone. All of a sudden you're seeing people going, well, you can't do this here and you can't do that there. That the policing of people, that self-righteousness that comes with that.
Right.
There's actually the Boston Globe did an article about, it said, don't be a Karen, be a Joan. And it was about my mom. Like, dude, we're gonna be somebody do this. So we have a hashtag now that says "Be a Joan," right?
I love that.
And I get Facebook messages from
people. I love that you brought up white fragility, because I had just finished reading that last week, and then had watched your documentary the next day. And when you had brought up at the end that your mom still has these tendencies, because after you read white fragility and you understand that racism isn't, this big bad thing. I mean, it's bad, but we automatically think it's this horrible thing over here, and we don't see our things over here that we do that fits in the category of racism. And hearing, you say that your mom still has those tendencies, but what she does is she stops and says, okay, why did I think that way?
Right.
What was it that caused it? And then you walk through it. And I think we all have that, because I think everyone.
After watching your documentary, after reading White Fragility and all of these other books, you realize I've done some things that I didn't know that I shouldn't have done or said. I didn't know that this fit to this category. And so then you can now, you educate yourself. Then when it happens, ask yourself why you felt that way and then fix it so that you do not do that again. And I think that's the process of every individual person. If we want to fix this problem, we need to start with ourselves.
Right. Yeah. It's when I'll talk, sometimes I'll give talks with, dialogue with corporations or whatever, and these groups and stuff. And I did a training with some teachers back in Virginia just recently, and over Zoom and stuff. But I said, I started off said, understand none of this is your fault, right? You can actually really say and be honest about saying, I didn't own any slaves. I hope you didn't, you don't. But I didn't own any slaves. I wasn't part of Jim Crow. It's like, yes, none of that is your fault. But what are you doing now? And what are you doing to perpetuate what's going on? Right? What's your role in this? And people don't really understand, how the brain works in this. And this is why I say, we're all prejudiced. So the brain actually takes in 11 million bits of information at any given moment in time, but we can only really process about 40. So what's it filling in the middle? And this is an evolutionary thing, because when a lion's charging towards you, or a bear or something, you don't want to sit there and process 11 million bits going, gee, I wonder what's going to happen, right? Stories you've been told. You have ever been charged by a bear, right? But all the stories you've been told, you might, everything in between, whatever you've seen in media and these sort of things tells you what's going to happen. And so instinctively you take off, right? So that's where we all prejudge. So when we have, a young black person who's wearing the hoodie, fits, is straight out of Central Casting, if you will, is walking towards us. Oh no, the tension builds. Now, black people do this too, right? Because they've all been fed the same diet, right? That we have this layer of judgment on an individual. And that's a survival thing. But we've been taught to think that. And that's part of the problem. And part of that is that history lesson that we go through, the whole thing of the criminal black man, right? The black beast rapist, all these narratives that play into this, and how we handle that now that we know, because now we have the films and so forth, or the information we read in the books. Now that you know, what are you going to do with it?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And what are you going to do to end it? I have people say, I don't teach my kids to be racist. I'm like, I believe you. But do you teach them not to be racist? Because there's a difference. And I say in the film, don't worry if your kids aren't racist, society will take care of it anyways, right? Unless you actively are doing something against it, then you are helping perpetuate it. Your silence is affirmation that everything is okay, that those jokes or whatever else, when someone says something at the office and you just, I don't feel comfortable saying anything back, or correcting somebody, then you are validating what is taking place. So we need to make sure that we aren't doing that we are making sure that there is that counter narrative. And as each of us take responsibility for ourselves and in our own homes and in our circles of influence, that's where the change is going to take place. The uncomfortable truth is just the first step of getting that knowledge. Levon, I was talking to him the other day, and he's like, I just watched the film again. I'm like, really? I can't watch it. But he's like, yeah, it's all right. I'm like, yeah, okay. I was like, but he says, what I really liked was the most important thing in the film to me, he said, was when we're all sitting down eating together. And that's what we need to be doing more of. Because after COVID, of course. But it's having those sit downs. There's something about having that meal and just experiencing each other just on this normal level. And when you get to know someone, when they're in your home or you're in theirs and such, and the walls the barriers start to come down, the fears, evaporate, and you can't have that hate through that fear and everything else. And that's where everything starts to change. Again, it's up to each of us to make that difference. My mom says, I can't do everything, but I can do something, because doing nothing's not an option.
I love that.
So I don't have to sit at the lunch counters because my mother already did, right? But I have to do what I can do, and I chose to do films. It's not a great way to make a living, but nonetheless, that's what I could do to contribute to the dialogue, to help move, continue that legacy and move things forward. So, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Loki, for that. And thank you for sharing this film with us, as well as An Ordinary Hero. This is The Uncomfortable Truth is available on Amazon Prime right now. It's included with Amazon Prime. It's a great time to watch it. It will, I think, if you watch it, you're going to be confronted with a few things, and that's probably a good thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And hopefully it will lead to conversations. You mentioned your foundation that you have. The same for your mother. Why don't you tell us where people can find information about that and how they can help contribute to that?
Yeah. So if you don't have Amazon Prime, you can actually, you can buy a DVD. People still do that from time to time, but you can get that all at the foundation's website, which is jtmfoundation.org. We exist to end racism through education. Something as simple as for example, a $5 monthly recurring donation, we can provide curriculum to 30 students. We've already helped, I think, about 30,000 students already.
Wow.
Providing curriculum that way. And the films are there. We have more educational material for teachers, reading guides, and interactive civil rights maps. So we continue to add to that, to the films. We have the podcast series as well, The Uncomfortable Truth, where we continue the conversation. We've been 21 episodes now.
Wow.
So yeah, we're just continuing to add to that, to help. This is what it's all about. We need each other to survive. So. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Loki, real quick before we let you go, do you feel like this is going to be a flashpoint? Because we've talked in a previous show about how every generation we're getting a little bit ahead of this. We're getting a little bit better at this, but we still have a long ways to go.
Yeah.
Do you see this as like the genesis of a big movement for the next generation?
Yeah, I've had a lot of conversations on that, and one, we shouldn't be surprised what we're seeing. There's always, after the Civil War, so you had this great opening after the Civil War, and then there's this retrenchment. We had a little bit of Reconstruction there, and that was nice, but then all of a sudden, boom, Jim Crow. After Jim Crow, hey, a little bit of breath, and then boom, war on drugs. We have Obama, right? Now, for a lot of people, that was a great thing. For some people, it wasn't. But we're seeing a reaction to that progressivism, right? That's where we're living in right now. But now there's just that, we're seeing this. What's most exciting when I'm talking to the old folks, the civil rights folks, they're saying, you know what, I've never seen it this mixed before.
Mm-hmm.
And that white people are coming out. And they're doing what they should have always been doing. I've told people, look, racism is a white person disease that we constantly ask African Americans to deal with. Solve our problems for us. Right? This is our problem. We need to be part of that solution. We created white supremacy. We should be at the forefront of ending it. So we need to be the ones like this program right here of having these dialogues and such. But I'm very hopeful. We oftentimes we kind of like this is like this YouTube generation. They have attention span of a goldfish, whatever else. People will move on. Well, the civil rights movement, it's so encapsulated in this, like in my film, for example, An Ordinary Hero, it's like, gosh, this thing was going nonstop, right? Not really. You'd have these moments here, you have the moments there. When you add them all up, it actually amounts to something. Brown versus Board of Education was 1954. It took 10 years to get the Voting Rights Act, or the Civil Rights Act, excuse me, in 1964, Voting Rights Act 65. During that time period, it wasn't nonstop. And it wasn't everywhere, but there was a lot of people doing a lot of things over time. that added up, and we're seeing that now. I think now because of technology, we're able to compress that more, and because more information is available and such. But what we do here in Utah, we need to focus on Utah. We're not going to change Minneapolis. We're not going to change Atlanta, right? Atlanta's going to change Atlanta. We need to change Utah. Bloom where you're planted, right? Hold people here accountable. Make the difference where you're at. But yeah, I have a lot of hope because it just feels different, and in particular because, quite frankly, just we're seeing more white people involved, as they should always be, right? This is America, and we're all in this together. So, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't want more to say. I'm just hopeful. I think it's exciting. I think it's great. We're living in history at the moment. There's still a lot of work to do.
Right.
Slide. And again, like what we change here, so you take a look at the sit-ins, for example. The first sit-in was February 1st, 1960. The first student sit-in that we recognize. That was in Greensboro, North Carolina, right? That one act led to, within months, 70,000 plus people involved in sit-ins. But Greensboro didn't change Jackson, which is 1963, the Jackson sit-in my mom's involved in. Jackson changed Jackson, right? And so we need to remember that, and we need to have the perseverance, the willingness to see it through. So.
Awesome. Well, thank you again,
much,
Loki.
Yeah.
We appreciate your time. This has been a wonderful conversation. I hope that as people have listened, that will lead to further conversations with your own circles and your own groups of friends and with each other. I think that's a big key to moving forward, is if we take the time to talk and listen and understand each other. And I think you're right. I think this is a great time, a hopeful time, and we all just need to be involved and keep moving it forward. So again, check out the film, The Uncomfortable Truth. It's an excellent piece. And until next time, we won't see you at the movies.
All right.